When the first ships carrying German prisoners of war reached American shores in 1944, silence fell across the decks. The men, many still in torn field uniforms, stared at something they had been told did not exist: a thriving, untouched nation. For years, Nazi propaganda had shown America as a land of chaos and weakness, a nation crippled by depression, ruled by corruption, divided by race. Yet as their ships entered New York Harbor and the skyline rose before them, the prisoners were stunned. Towering skyscrapers gleamed in the sunlight. Cargo ships filled the ports. Trains thundered across bridges, moving endless supplies. It was a living picture of power on a scale they had never imagined. Many German soldiers had expected bombed-out ruins, hunger, and disorder. Instead, they saw abundance, cars crowding the streets, factories running day and night, civilians dressed in fine clothes, children eating ice cream in the open air. "We thought America was poor and falling apart," one POW later said. "But when we saw the cities, we realized how wrong we were." As the trains carried them inland toward the camps, the shock deepened. Through the windows, they saw vast fields of wheat and corn stretching endlessly to the horizon. Perfectly organized farms with tractors and silos, roads smoother and wider than anything in Europe. Even the small towns seemed alive with motion. Diners, gas stations, bright neon signs. To men who had grown up in the rubble and rationing of wartime Germany, it felt like stepping into another world. For some, the most unforgettable moment was seeing American factories in motion. The scale of industry was overwhelming. Assembly lines producing trucks and tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Railways moving raw materials across thousands of miles without interruption. And a workforce that included women, something unthinkable under Hitler's ideology. One prisoner recalled passing a giant plant surrounded by freight cars and smokestacks. "I understood then," he said, "why we could not win this war. The Americans could build faster than we could shoot." Even the food reflected industrial strength. Canned meats, fresh bread, fruit, and milk were served in quantities that seemed impossible during wartime. In Germany, civilians stood in line for hours for a loaf of bread. In America, prisoners of war were fed 3 full meals a day, often better than what their families received at home. The realization was painful, but also awakening. The myth of a weak and decadent enemy had shattered. What stood before them was a nation of organization, creativity, and efficiency. A machine powered not by fear, but by freedom. For young soldiers like Günter Graver, it was the first time they understood the true scale of the war they had been fighting. They were not just up against an army. They were up against an entire civilization built on production, science, and unity. And as they gazed through the train, windows at the endless expanse of American power, one thought echoed silently among them all: "This is why we lost." After the shock of their arrival, the German prisoners began to witness the inner workings of what they called the American machine. It wasn't just the factories or the ships. It was how everything in the United States seemed to function with precision, purpose, and confidence. Many POWs were assigned to work details outside the camps, harvesting crops, repairing roads, loading freight. From these glimpses, they began to understand the secret behind America's strength. Everything was connected. Trucks delivered food to camps on time. Trains ran with clockwork accuracy. And even the smallest towns had electricity, refrigeration, and organized supply systems. To men who had lived through constant shortages in Germany, it felt unbelievable. They had gasoline for every truck, rubber for every tire, and meat for every table, one former prisoner later said. In Germany, we could not even find soap. The prisoners were astonished by how much of the American workforce consisted of civilians, not soldiers, not forced laborers, but ordinary people working freely. They saw women driving tractors, operating machinery, and managing shops. To men raised under Nazi ideology, which claimed women belonged only in the home, it was an entirely new vision of society. Even the farms felt like industrial marvels. Instead of horses and plows, there were powerful tractors, automatic irrigation, and giant grain silos. Some prisoners picked cotton in the South and marveled at machines that could harvest faster than hundreds of men. Others worked in the Midwest, where endless trains hauled produce and livestock across the continent. Everywhere they went, they saw abundance. Gas stations lit up the highways. Stores displayed goods in every window, and newspapers were filled with advertisements for new cars, radios, and washing machines, even in wartime. It was proof of something the prisoners had never been told. America's strength didn't come only from its weapons. It came from its people. Günther Grevelater said that what impressed him most wasn't the size of America's factories, but their energy. The workers laughed while they worked, he remembered. They were not afraid. They worked fast because they wanted to, not because someone shouted at them. In the camps, the POWs often discussed what they saw. Some refused to believe it could last. They are rich now, one said bitterly, but it will collapse. Others disagreed. They saw the truth, that the American system was built on freedom of thought and cooperation, not fear and control. The more they observed, the more they realized how deeply propaganda had blinded them. In Germany, they had been told that democracy was weak, that only dictatorship could make a nation great. But in America, even the smallest worker could speak freely, and that freedom had built an empire of steel, food, and ideas. By the end of 1945, thousands of prisoners came to a quiet conclusion. Germany had fought for power through domination. America had achieved it through production, unity, and faith in its citizens. And to men who had once believed the Reich would last 1,000 years, that realization was the most powerful lesson of all. By 1945, something unexpected was happening inside the American POW camps. The German prisoners, once proud soldiers of Hitler's army, began to question everything they had believed about democracy, about war, and about themselves. They had arrived believing the United States was a land of chaos and weakness. Nazi propaganda had told them that democracy was a system, ruled by money and corruption. But day by day, they saw a completely different reality. The American guards treated them with a level of respect they could not understand. They were given food, real food, far better than what their families were eating back home. They had libraries, classes, even musical instruments. In some camps, they could study English, history, or agriculture. One former soldier, Hans-Werner Richter, recalled, "We expected hatred. Instead, we were treated like men." That was the moment something began to break inside me. It was not kindness alone that shocked them. It was freedom. The guards did not shout or threaten. Orders were given calmly. Punishment was rare. The prisoners realized that discipline in America didn't come from fear. It came from mutual respect. In the evenings, they listened to American radio. They heard jazz, news debates, and sometimes even political criticism, open disagreement with the government. To them, it was unthinkable. In Nazi Germany, to question authority was to risk your life. Here it was part of everyday life. Slowly, the walls inside their minds began to crumble. Many started to attend lectures organized by American officers. Discussions about democracy, the Constitution, and free speech. At first, they attended out of curiosity. Later, they stayed because they wanted to understand. One program created by the U.S. Army called the Intellectual Diversion Program distributed thousands of books and films showing how the American system worked. The goal wasn't propaganda, it was education. And it worked. A former Luftwaffe pilot later wrote, "I had been taught that only the strong man could lead a nation. But in America, I saw that strength could exist without cruelty. Power could exist without fear." Some prisoners even began writing their own newspapers inside the camps. Debating politics and ethics, they argued about the meaning of justice, about guilt, and about whether the German people could ever rebuild trust with the world. By 1946, thousands of German POWs had changed in ways they couldn't have imagined. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were students of a new way of life. When they were finally sent home, they carried with them more than just memories of the camps. They carried an idea that democracy was not weakness, but strength, that dignity could be shared, not forced, and that freedom, once seen, could never be forgotten. Many of these men would later help rebuild West Germany into a democratic nation. The lessons they had learned, behind the barbed wire of America's POW camps, would echo for generations, long after the war was over. By 1946, the gates of America's POW camps began to open. Thousands of German prisoners, soldiers, officers, engineers, and students were put on ships bound for Europe. The war was over, but their inner battle had just begun. They had left Germany as soldiers of the Reich. They returned as witnesses of another world, a world of freedom, fairness, and possibility. When they arrived, they found a nation in ruins. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were nothing but skeletons of concrete. Families were broken, food was scarce, and hope was almost gone. The Nazi regime had promised a 1,000-year empire. It had lasted 12, but among the rubble something began to stir. The men who had seen America with their own eyes began to speak. Quietly at first, but with conviction, they told neighbors and friends about the country they had seen. Where the police served the people, where the press could question leaders, where a worker could talk to a general without fear. For many, these stories sounded like fantasy. Yet they came from men who had once believed in Hitler, and that gave their words power. Some former POWs, like Heinz Kuhn and Erich Maschke, went on to become teachers, writers, and political thinkers. They spoke about democracy not as an abstract idea, but as something they had lived inside the camps. Others helped create local political groups that would later merge into the foundation of West. Germany's democratic institutions. The U.S. government recognized this transformation. In reports sent back to Washington, American officers described how many returning POWs had become unofficial ambassadors of democracy. The education they had received in captivity was now shaping the moral recovery of Germany. Not everyone accepted them. Some Germans saw these men as traitors or Americanized, but time would prove otherwise. Many of the ideas that guided West Germany's rebirth, local self-governance, open debate, and personal responsibility, found their first voice among those who had once been behind barbed wire. In 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was founded, some of the former prisoners took part in its early political and educational reforms. They helped introduce democratic teaching into schools, rebuilt communities, and worked to keep extremism from returning. One of them later wrote, "America defeated us with weapons, but it conquered us with its spirit." The experience of the German POWs in America became a quiet turning point in history, proof that even in the aftermath of war, human decency and freedom could plant seeds stronger than hatred. By the time the last prisoners returned home, they carried more than their duffel bags. They carried an invisible inheritance, the belief that a nation's strength lies not in its fear, but in its freedom. And though few monuments honor them, their journey from captives to citizens helped shape the democratic soul of modern Germany, a legacy born not on the battlefield, but in the classrooms and quiet corners of America's POW camps.